The state legislature is considering a bill to raise the minimum wage in Massachusetts. This would be the first increase since 2008, and the minimum would go from $8 an hour to $10. As in past years, there is support from organized labor and opposition from some business leaders. Supporters say when it comes to the cost of living in Massachusetts, people at the bottom of the pay scale are being left farther behind, but opponents say higher pay would mean fewer jobs. And there's one more analysis from the Mass Budget and Policy Center. We'd like to welcome its Executive Director, Noah Berger.
Good to be here.
Thank you very much for being with us, Noah. Talk about who this really matters to, since most people, even watching the show, they make something above minimum. So why is this such a big deal?
Yeah. You're right. It affects the lowest wage workers in our state, but actually a fairly large pool of low wage workers. That is, raising the minimum wage to $10 an hour would affect both the people who are directly affected and those who are a little over $10 whose wages would be pushed up. Together would be a little bit over 600,000 people. So about 1 in 5 working people in the Commonwealth, the lowest income 1 in 5 working people, would see their wages go up somewhat as a result of raising the minimum wage.
There once was a time when $10 an hour sounded like a lot of money, even to me, but what's been happening all this time?
Yeah, you're right. In fact, if you adjust for inflation, back in 1968, the minimum wage was worth more than $10 an hour. And a minimum wage worker then working full-time would have earned about $21,000 a year. Fast forward to today with the effects of inflation, a minimum wage worker today who works full-time earns about $16,000 a year. So about $5,000 a year less than in 1968. Even though we've become a wealthier country over that time period, we've just seen that growing inequality where wages at the high end have gone up fairly significantly. Wages in the middle have sort of bounced along, not going up nearly as much as you would want in a strong economy. But the value of the minimum wage since 68 has gone down by 24%. Just since 1979 has gone down by 11%.
Compare Massachusetts to other states. I know in general we're sort of a high-income state, but as far as the minimum wage, where are we exactly?
Our minimum wage, I believe, 5th in the country. So there are about a dozen states that have minimum wages higher than the federal minimum wage. We're sort of in the middle of those states. You raised another question earlier, which I think is really important, which is the question of the effect on the economy of raising the minimum wage. And there are two issues here. One is jobs in general. And there have been a lot of studies that looked at the question of when you raise the minimum wage, what happens to overall employment? And a famous one was done back about 20 years ago by Alan Kruger, who was then at Princeton, is now the head of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and another economist, David Card. They looked at New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where New Jersey had just raised the minimum wage. They had a higher minimum wage. Pennsylvania had a lower minimum wage, and they have a long border. So you could look at the effects across the border, and they looked at the restaurant industry to see, was there less employment in the state that had the higher minimum wage? And they famously found no, that there wasn't a significant effect. And then just last year, there was a big study done by a team of economists to look at every pair of counties around the country that were across the border, and where one state had a higher minimum wage and the other a lower. And again, they found no significant, they found that wages were higher in the state with a higher minimum wage, but not much of an employment effect. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. Workers who get slightly higher wages sometimes you don't have quite as high of turnover, you don't spend as much on training, and workers are more loyal. But there's another effect which is also important during times of recession, or now, and we're not technically in recession, but our economy is still underperforming, which is that the best way to strengthen an economy is to increase demand, to make sure people have money so that they can buy goods and services in their community. And a lot of evidence suggests the people who are most likely to spend the money they have are lower income working people, or low income people generally, because they have to spend everything they have to get by. Very high income people or corporations we see save a lot of money, leave it on the sidelines. So when you raise the minimum wage, the effect is to shift resources towards lower income people who then in those local communities will buy goods and services from their local businesses. That creates more demand. Those businesses now have customers. It gives them a reason to hire more people. You can have that kind of positive feedback effect. So in difficult economic times, raising minimum wage can actually have a sort of a stimulative effect to create jobs and strengthen the economy more generally.
Has there ever been a measure showing that?
There's a lot of work's been done by a group called the Economic Policy Institute in Washington that's tried to estimate the exact effects of how much of a stimulus you can have. And they find, it's not enormous numbers of jobs, but it can be several thousand jobs in a state the size of Massachusetts. So I think the direct effect of a minimum wage is obviously just raising the incomes of those low-income 600,000 people who would be directly affected. But to the extent that there's a broader economic impact, it's likely that in times of recession, it's actually more a positive impact than negative. Now, there's no free lunch. When you pay a worker more, that does mean that either profits are going to go down somewhat, or prices, some of it's go up a little bit. But for the sake of a local economy, if there's a big national retailer and they have to pay their workers in Massachusetts a little bit more, that likely will mean more revenue, in the pockets of people in Massachusetts. And if there's a little hit on their profits nationally or worldwide, that's not going to have the same sort of magnitude of effect.
We can imagine Walmart handling this pretty well, but what about smaller businesses? Which sectors are really most directly affected by this?
Yeah, retail, restaurants, leisure and hospitality generally are affected. Those are the sectors that have the most effect, and their workers tend to be the very low-wage workers that have are working near that minimum wage.
One thing people have been arguing against the minimum wage for a long time is that it hurts the most vulnerable people, whether it's young people, people of color, or workers who have jobs but are low-paying jobs, and maybe a few more of them could get laid off if the minimum wage goes up.
Yeah, I've heard people make that argument. I've very rarely heard that argument from those people. I mean, the people who do have low-wage jobs, most people who work in minimum wage jobs are not teenagers. Most are older than that. Most people who work in minimum wage jobs work more than half time. So it's directly affecting the wages of those working people who are struggling to support themselves and their families. And there are these people who make those claims, but they tend often to be they tend not to be the people who are directly affected by this, who tend more likely to see the positive effects. And most economists who look at it say, to the extent there's any employment effect, it's very small, and it's much more than outweighed by raising wages of literally hundreds of thousands of people who work, often full-time at pretty low wages.
Well, the other thing employers can do is raise prices.
Yes, they can. It turns out that the wages of low-wage workers are not a huge component of the overall price structure. So if you think of a fast food restaurant, you have the building, you have the management salaries, you have the food itself, you have the advertising, and sort of the wages of the low-wage workers are a small enough component of the overall structure that even if those go up somewhat, it's a pretty small percentage on the sort of overall price of the goods. But you're right, there's no, the costs do shift around and they have to land somewhere. I think the question is raising the wages of our lowest wage workers, the people who have fallen furthest behind, an important policy goal, and is it worth perhaps slightly higher prices, although pretty slightly, and perhaps slightly lower profits, to put money into the pockets of those people, which obviously helps those people directly, but really could also help those communities, help people have the ability to buy stuff in their local stores. So I think it is really important to look at all of those questions and then make those judgments about what the priorities are.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Great, thank you.
From the Mass Budget and Policy Center, Noah Berger.